All right, so what we're going to work with today is we're going to start working on the endocrine system. So, endocrine system, much like the nervous system, is one of the what I would kind of call command and control systems of the body. It's definitely involved in a lot of its function is definitely involved in regulating functions of a lot of other systems. And again, not to say it doesn't do stuff on its own, but it definitely, and like I said, a lot of cases is influencing the function of a lot of other systems. A little bit different than the nervous system in that we're using hormones in the bloodstream, not the nervous system. So again, why do we have this? It is again a lot about maintaining control of the body. So it, along with the nervous system, is really going to be maintaining a lot of homeostatic mechanisms within the body. So things like blood composition and volume is definitely controlled by this. Different influences of different reproductive activities. So with development as well as normal functioning of it is going to be things that the hypothalamus through the pituitary gland are going to control. Uh, Growth, metabolism, different levels there, how we digest stuff, how much things we're secreting, definitely all being influenced by the endocrine system. And again, very similar to the nervous system. Nervous system, again, usually shorter, quicker to act, shorter lasting, where endocrine is going to a lot of times do a much longer term activity. Change, I mean, I always kind of say going through puberty is a one-way thing. It's pretty permanent, the changes that the endocrine system brings about. And really it does this by releasing different hormones. So this is going to alter a lot of times with different tissues through either hormones or a series of hormones, change that. And again, how it responds to these is a lot like we were talking about the autonomic nervous system, is that the neurotransmitter, or in this case a hormone, how it's going to act on a particular cell is, does that cell have the receptor or not? So any cell that has a receptor for a particular hormone is going to be a target cell of that. And very much like the autonomics that we were talking about, it is possible to have one hormone have different effects on different tissues based on receptor subtypes or other things like that. And we can definitely have these cells communicating with one another with different messengers in local areas as well that we kind of put in with the endocrine system but is not technically used in the bloodstream. So again, these are mainly epithelial glands that are going to secrete some type of endocrine product, some type of hormone that's going to get taken up into the blood supply or act in a paracrine or autocrine fashion very locally. These, because of this, are going to have generally really good blood supply to these particular glands, so they can take up those hormones rather easily. And again, we see these in two different ways. We're going to see some endocrine organs that the whole organ is the endocrine organ. Things like the thyroid gland, for example. The other thing we can see is a lot of times there's going to be certain subsets of cells within a organ that are having an endocrine function, but that is not the only thing that organ is doing. So the stomach is going to have some endocrine cells, for example. We could talk about the pancreas and the islet cells in the pancreas. A lot of the pancreas is doing digestive materials, but it does have a subset of cells that are making insulin and glucagon. So those are some of the examples of these smaller clusters within a bigger organ. And again, we're just going to look at, initially on these ones, look at some of these different glands. Again, we're going to work through all these and kind of figure out when and where this is, what we need to know about each of them, and we will go through each of these in detail. So this is things like the pituitary gland, pineal gland, thyroid glands, parathyroid glands, adrenal glands. These are all some of these single organ ones. So parathyroid glands are nodules on the back of the thyroid gland. We're going to see they have a couple different cell subtypes in there as an example of a single organ type of thing here. Endocrine glands within other organs. These, like I said, are tiny clusters within that. So hypothalamus is part of the brain. It is doing other functions, but it does have some endocrine cells in it. Skin, thymus, heart, heart, liver, stomach. There's some examples I already gave. The pancreas. The small intestine also has some what we call enteroendocrine cells, as well as the kidney being able to release things like renin, which we'll talk about when we get to blood pressure. But that is a subset of what the kidney is doing. It's a small subset of cells in there. And this is kind of giving you the overview of a lot of this. So we are going to talk in detail I'll kind of try to point out the ones we're going to talk about in more detail and ones that we will hit a lot more in other times. So hypothalamus, pituitary gland, we're definitely going to talk about in a great amount of detail in this chapter. Thyroid gland, adrenal glands as well. Great amount of detail in this chapter. We are going to mention the thymus. We will talk about it more with the immune system, but even there we don't go super deep into that one. We'll make mention of the pineal gland here, but we're not going to go super deep into that, and in all honesty, we don't go super deep into it anywhere. Parathyroid glands we will talk about here. We've also talked a lot about this already when we talked about blood calcium levels and AMP1. That is the main hormone it's dealing with, that parathyroid hormone. I will make mention of this here, but in the heart we will talk a lot more about ANP, this natriuretic peptide, atrial natriuretic peptide. The kidney we will also talk about in more detail in a couple different areas. The EPO we'll talk about when we talk about the blood. We've talked about calcitriol already in the AMP1 with the skeletal system. Renin we'll talk about when we get to the blood vessels in a lot more detail. We will mention some of this. Again, we don't go very deep into this at all. The digestive hormones, for this chapter, know that they exist. We will talk about those in the digestive system, so things like gastrin in the stomach and some of these cholecystokinin type of things that we'll see in the intestines. We will definitely talk about insulin and glucagon with the pancreatic islets. And again, we will make mention of these and do a brief introduction to the gonads, but the actual functioning of and how they work in a lot more detail is going to be saved for the last chapter this semester, which is going to be the reproductive system of the male and female. So a lot of these are through some type of, they can be through a few different types of stimulation, through these reflexive stimulations. So we can see generally what's going to trigger an endocrine gland to release something is either going to be hormonal, what we refer to as hormonal, humoral, or nervous related. Hormonal stimulation is going to be some type of hormone acting on that tissue to cause it to release its hormone. So, for example, a lot of the endocrine system is being functioned by endocrine hormones. So, for example, the pituitary gland can release something called thyroid stimulating hormone, which is a hormone which is going to act on the thyroid to cause it to release T3 and T4, which are these higher thyroid hormones. And those can then act on target cells. So that would be an example of hormonal stimulation of our endocrine gland. We can also get what is called humoral stimulation. This is a gland responding to changes in some type of metabolite a lot of time, or a nutrient. So for example, the pancreas, both glucagon and insulin, we can respond to glucose levels in the blood. Too high, we're going to release insulin. Too low, we're going to release glucagon. So that'd be an example of that humoral stimulation, a level of something causing a release of a particular hormone. And the last one is nervous stimulation. We can see in a couple different spots, the posterior pituitary releasing ADH and oxytocin, for example, is nervous stimulation. You get a nerve impulse causing the release of that. We can also get stimulation of the adrenal medulla for epinephrine and norepinephrine. We can get that causing release of those hormones through a nerve stimulation. So those are really the three different ways that really the release of some type of hormone is going to be triggered. The other thing we need to kind of talk about is some of these different types of hormones. We're going to see we have different subclasses of hormones. So we really, if you think about the overall classes, we have lipid-based hormones and we have protein-based ones. So steroid hormones would be an example of one of these that falls into this lipid-based ones. So these are based off of cholesterol. This generally is going to be, it's the same ring structure, is why we say that, and we use that as the starting point. Things like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and then also some of the adrenal cortex ones that we'll talk about, things like cortisol, are going to be considered to be steroid hormones. Sometimes they throw calcitriol into this one, not so worried that we're not going to get too worried about whether or not on that one. Protein-based hormones, most of them are this one. These are going to be small chains of amino acids. These are not lipid soluble or water soluble. And one of the things we'll get into is how these actual function or how they work what we can refer to as their mechanism of action, is going to end up being a little bit different. So some of the examples of protein-based hormones would be things like insulin, glucagon, parathyroid hormone, would all be examples of these protein-based hormones. Some of these can be shorter in nature, so these oligopeptides, things like oxytocin and ADH, are much shorter chains of amino acids, only 3 to 10. And we're going to see there is some of these proteins that have sugars attached, things like follicle-stimulating hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, are going to be what we refer to as glycoproteins. The other thing we can see is some of these would be kind of protein-based, but these are modified amino acids or chains of a single amino acid. A lot of times refer to these as biogenic amines. So things like epinephrine and norepinephrine and thyroid hormone are going to be examples of these. Thyroid hormone is a little bit of a weird one. It's all of these other ones are water soluble, but thyroid hormone is not. It's non-polar because of these tyrosine amino acids, and it functions a little bit more like a lipid-based hormone. And this is just showing you some of these different examples. So you can see, based off a lipid, that chain structure, that ring structure, you can see the chain structure of a protein-based hormone, either big one, small, medium-sized one, or those with sugars attached, where some of these are going to be modified amino acids, things like norepinephrine, where it's a much smaller hormone than that. A lot of these, where we have to kind of put this one in here, these local hormones that we're going to mention now are technically not endocrine in that they're not traveling through the blood, but they don't really fit also. They're not going through a duct either. So this is where we kind of put these in. But these local hormones are generally considered to be kind of part of the endocrine system. Sometimes we don't classify these as hormones, but these are a cell releasing a something that, or a substance that can act on neighboring cells or act back on itself. So that's a lot of times what we refer to as a local hormone. So again, not going into the bloodstream. These are going to be things like what we refer to as like carcinoids. If you want to get into a lot more detail on these ones, this is something a lot of times that you'll talk about in like a cell biology course in signaling. These are made from fatty acids. So it's a modified fatty acid of this long chain of carbons. Again, similar in structure to a phospholipid. And it's really an enzymatic process. I remember in grad school learning all about this process, of which I remember none of it now at this point. Shows you how much I used it. But again, initially it's going to be modifying this. You get later enzymes that can turn it into things like leukotrienes, prostaglandins, and thromboxanes. Prostaglandins, a lot of times we refer to those with inflammatory response, thromboxanes, blood clotting things here. And a lot of times these local hormones can act in what we refer to as an autocrine fashion, where it can be released by the cell and act right back on that same cell. That would be autocrine. Paracrine is if it's released from a certain cell and acts on neighboring cells. So those neighboring cells would be being stimulated in a paracrine fashion. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. Something can act in an autocrine fashion back on itself as well as act on neighboring cells, so that would be doing both autocrine and paracrine stimulation. So they don't have to be mutually exclusive on this. And again, a lot of this is going to be inflammatory response, stimulating pain receptors with these carcinoids. And again, this just shows you this whole overall layout here. To me, just understanding that there's different types of hormones and some of the basics of what is in which class is the type of stuff I would expect you to do. This is not going to be an essay question that explained to me all the functions of carcinoids and how they work, or list all of the small protein-based 200 amino acid type of hormones. We're not going to do something like that. But again, this is understanding the basic subtypes and some examples that would be present within those. So what we'll be working through on next here is we're going to start talking about mechanism of action on some of these ones. And then once we get through that, we're going to then get into kind of the overall endocrine system, what's regulating it overall. And then we're going to work through organ by organ, talking about what is the organ, what hormone does it make, what is the action of that hormone. So I will see you next time.